in the minds of many in the West, the Biden administration used the auspices of Boris Johnson to send him to Kiev to scuttle the Istanbul Agreement, which had been initialed, if you believe Russia's telling of the history, and I think contemporary reporting supports that telling of history. There was an agreement. There were some, let's say, incidents within Ukraine that made it perhaps politically difficult for Zelensky to accept that agreement after it was initialed. But nonetheless, a deal was on the table to be had, and it was foregone. And the resulting 3 years of military conflict was substituted in its place. And again, I'm only sort of telling you what Trump believes to be true.
Hello and welcome back to Soar Financially, a channel where we discuss the macro to understand the micro. My name is Kai Hoffman. I'm the EdJR mining guy over on X, and of course, your host of this channel. Really appreciate you joining us for an interview with Doomberg. He's also known as the Green Chicken, but also he runs the most successful finance Substack newsletter on Substack. Right. I'm really excited to have him join us because with him, we always discuss European energy policies and Europe. It's interesting because he's based in the U.S. and I learned so much from him about what we're doing here in Germany. We got elections coming up this weekend, so that could be quite interesting. Although personally, I don't expect a lot of change. We'll have to see what our guest's opinion on that is, and we'll have to catch up on what is happening in Russia-Ukraine war right now. Lots being discussed in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. What's the fallout and how does that influence energy policies and energy prices moving forward as well? Lots to discuss in a very short time period or in a very short time frame. So quick reminder, hit that like and subscribe button. Free way to support us. Tremendously appreciate it. Now, Doomberg, it's great to have you back on. It's good to see you.
Kai Hoffman, my friend, how are you?
Doing great. I'm actually in a really good mood. Not sure why, but I'm chipper. It's good.
Yeah, well, there's not much going on in the world, so it's a good time to take a step back and reflect, I suppose.
Yeah, we got to reflect on a few things because there is a lot happening, but we got to make sense of it. Lot happening without us, meaning us, Germany and Europe right now. A lot of it being discussed without us. It seems like Europe is irrelevant. Maybe we'll start there, Doomberg. Catch us up. What's the role of Europe in the world right now?
It's a great question. I think actually to understand where we are and how we got here, we have to actually go one step further, which is to recognize just what a transformational figure Donald Trump is. Love him or hate him, he's certainly a polarizing figure, but few could deny that he is disruptive and transformative. And I think his ascension back to the position of President of the United States will go down in the decades that follow as one of the most important events of this time period. And he came into office with a clear agenda that he had articulated for years prior to the election. And he has been swiftly executing that agenda exactly as he laid out that he would prior to the campaign. And he comes to office with a completely different worldview than the Biden administration and the sort of current governing elite of the European Union. And he's not one for nuance. He's not one necessarily even for elegance. He is a businessman with an agenda who is hyper-focused on achieving that agenda. And in his worldview, the war over Ukraine and in Ukraine was a catastrophic blunder of his predecessor and one that he has almost no tolerance for, wishes it would go away, and is in the process of normalizing relations with Russia because he views Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping as formidable competitors for sure, but people with whom business can be done. Again, your own particular thoughts on the matter aren't as relevant as what Trump's views on the matter are, and our effort to understand them has consumed most of our work in 2025, as I'm sure it has for you.
Absolutely. No, it's almost like you come into the office on Monday morning and you try to catch up with what he said over the weekend, right?
Yeah.
Because you try not to watch the news over the weekend, at least switch off because it's almost impossible. Trying to catch up on what he's been doing, tariff announcements, Ukraine war comments, like maybe we'll stick on that topic because he came out. I think it was last night. I only saw it this morning, but he even accused Ukraine of starting the war. And I'm quoting here: "You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine." Like that's what he said. Like, and just trying to catch up on that, trying to put some perspective around that. What does he mean by that? Because he's accusing someone here that it should have never started.
There's a view in conservative circles in the United States and in some quarters in Europe that the war could have ended with the Istanbul Agreement, and that the decision to forego that agreement and to continue the conflict was a decision of the West. That's a controversial view. History will have to decide the accuracy of it, but that it is held by Trump and his inner circle is what's important. So in the minds of many in the West, the Biden administration used the auspices of Boris Johnson to send him to Kiev to scuttle the Istanbul Agreement, which had been initialed, if you believe Russia's telling of the history, and I think contemporary reporting supports that telling of history. There was an agreement. There were some, let's say, incidents within Ukraine that made it perhaps politically difficult for Zelensky to accept that agreement after it was initialed. But nonetheless, a deal was on the table to be had, and it was foregone. And the resulting 3 years of military conflict was substituted in its place. And again, I'm only sort of telling you what Trump believes to be true. And so when he says you started the war, I think what he really meant to say, because he's not the most, again, sometimes he can be inarticulate in his views. I think what he meant to say was you could have ended this very quickly after hostilities first broke out. And the real war, the protracted war, began after the Istanbul Agreement fell apart.
Like, maybe coming back to my first question here, the role of Europe in all this. You mentioned Boris Johnson, the UK, not really part of Europe anymore. Of course, we're still attached, but not really part of Europe in general. It's like, what is the role of Europe right now? France, Germany, Italy, perhaps? Like, what's the role in all of these discussions right now? Because it seems like we're being completely ignored, yet we're stuck in the middle.
It's an interesting question, and you actually alluded to it, perhaps even unintentionally. We're developing internally a model around the relationship between the United Kingdom and Donald Trump. And we believe that this model might explain most of what we're observing, even the 51st state talk and Governor Trudeau and all of the other sort of trolling that Trump has done since he was inaugurated. We believe that Trump and the British are basically at war with each other. In Trump's eyes, it was British intelligence that tried to tank his first presidency with the Russiagate situation and the Steele dossier and the Cambridge affair and all of those things. And this is not something that he has forgotten. Keir Starmer, I think, in a catastrophic blunder, sent 100 members of the Labour Party to actively campaign against Donald Trump and for his opponent, Vice President Harris. And the British seem to be in denial that Trump is now president. And so we have this amazing dichotomy of Trump's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, sitting down with his formidable contemporary Sergei Lavrov in Saudi Arabia, negotiating an end to the war and also many other topics, while you have Keir Starmer writing an editorial in the Telegraph proclaiming that Ukraine's path to NATO is irreversible and talking about sending troops into Ukraine. And then you have this bizarre meeting in Paris, summoned by, organized by Emmanuel Macron, where some of the leaders in Europe gathered, and even there, no consensus could be reached, and the meeting kind of fell apart. But the world has shifted under the feet of the British, and they don't seem to be recognizing it or dealing with the reality as it is. In what universe do the British people support sending their military into Ukraine, or even imagine that it would be a meaningful contribution to the war? And so we have this really interesting situation where the US is clearly walking away from Europe. Pete Hegseth's speech was, I think, a profoundly important one. J.D. Vance's speech has gotten most of the headlines. Trump's commentary, either during these rolling press gaggles that he has while he's signing executive orders or various press conferences that he holds, like the one you mentioned in Mar-a-Lago last night, the, the, the direction of travel is very clear. Trump has very little use for the British and by extension for Europe. I think he views them as weak. Trump is a strong man, so to speak, and so he just gravitates towards the Vladimir Putin's and the Xi Jinping's of the world, and he wants to cut deals with them. I could guarantee you that one of the things being discussed in Saudi Arabia is Exxon's return to Russia. Coca-Cola's return to Russia. MasterCard and Visa's return to Russia. Trump wants to do business. He wants to end wars. He wants to cut military spending. He wants to balance his budget. He wants to reinvigorate U.S. manufacturing. And this is the path that he said he would take. And I think the European leaders, back to your question, have been caught totally off guard, almost inexcusably so. And I think they're scrambling.
Absolutely, we're scrambling because we're without leadership more or less here in Germany. France still on shaky ground. UK completely being ignored, as you said as well. Keir Starmer, based on what I'm reading on Twitter, to a degree, is also not really the most authoritative figure there and not being the most respected. So Europe is in turmoil. Maybe I can share my screen real quick. I've got something else lined up, like German tabloids this morning. Let's see if I can quickly bring it up here. See if it works. Yeah, it does. Just real quick, so Europe in fear, we fear that the U.S. will just remove its troops. Like Germany has quite a few bases, Ramstein, Grafenwehr, and many others, where a lot of U.S. Troops are based. Why are we scared? Maybe we need to explain that as well, because this headline here is Europe is scared that the U.S. will remove its troops. Why? Are we so dependent on the U.S. and why are we so naive, perhaps?
So, in the worldview that I think exists in the minds of most of Europe, and especially most of European leadership, Putin is a dictator on the march. And if he's not stopped in Ukraine, then he will roll, through Poland and into Germany and onto Paris. And so if that is your worldview, the pullout of the United States, which I think is a real possibility for reasons we can discuss perhaps after this question. But the pullout of the United States necessarily means that Europe will have to spend enormous sums on their own defense. And frankly, it's money that they don't have, especially in light of their catastrophic blunders in the energy sector. Europe is wholly dependent on the outside world for energy and weapons, and so on. And the societies just aren't prepared to go onto a war footing. Their economies are deindustrializing. They're losing share of exports to places like China, and they have to pay for expensive natural gas from places like the US to keep the lights on. And so if the US leaves Europe, and you believe Putin has eyes for Western Europe, then there's perfectly rational reasons to be afraid. One of the challenges with that worldview, of course, is it's taken 3 years and Putin still has not recaptured the 4 regions that are disputed. I can't imagine that he would suddenly, roll hundreds and hundreds of miles in a very short period of time and take over Western Europe. I happen to think such fears are vastly unfounded. But nonetheless, I think, to answer your specific question, it's that combination of the fear that Putin has ambitions beyond Ukraine and the complete inability to defend themselves against such ambitions should they materialize.
Are those fears even valid? Of course, media always tries to draw a picture and we need a villain that we can all hate together. So we're united, of course. But is that even does that even make sense to have that fear? Is that rational? In my personal view, no. Do I understand why the propaganda is laced with such fear mongering? Yes. But I think we should let's find out, stop the war and see what happens. In my personal view is that there's a long and complex history that led to the situation we find ourselves in. And there's a path out that optimizes the likelihood for a long and durable peace. Now,
the mistakes of the past aren't without consequence. I mean, the country of Ukraine has been destroyed, and NATO, including the U.S. and by extension Trump, have been defeated on the battlefield by Russia. And we have lost the war. One of the reasons why you shouldn't get into wars is that you might lose them. Sometimes, of course, you have no choice, and critics of what I'm saying would argue that we had no choice here. But to our point earlier, that Trump is certainly making the case that there was a deal on the table that is, in hindsight, certainly preferable to the current situation. We lost the war. The sanctions war backfired. We lost that war. And the best of NATO's weapons were defeated on the battlefield. That is a strategic defeat of NATO. And by the way, losing wars is hard. And the manner in which this particular war is lost remains to be seen, but it is lost. And I think, the admission of defeat is sort of the first step. The people of Ukraine have suffered greatly because of these missteps, and how we, return to normal from here is extremely challenging.
Like, why have we lost the war? Like, maybe not why, but like, how do you where do you pinpoint like that we lost? Like, I'm trying to put some like sense around it. Like, sanctions didn't work. Okay, we lost the sanctions war. I think that one is easy to understand. Russian economics or the Russian economy is doing well. They're not hurting as badly as the Western media makes it out to be. But on the battlefield, like, why do you say we've lost? Like, so, I'm just trying to pinpoint because they're not in Kiev. So it's like trying to understand what that really means.
Well, again, that Putin has eyes for Kiev is a story we tell ourselves. The objectives of what they call the special military operation have been laid out very clearly, which is the reoccupation of the 4 territories, which they have worked into their own constitution as now being part of Russia. Most of those territories have been retaken. There's some sizable chunks of land that have not yet. But if you just go to Ukrainian mapping projects like Deep State, which I follow every day and have been following every day for over a year now, as we first wrote about this in a piece called Mapping the War, where you could just follow along at home. If you pull up the line of contact today versus a year ago versus the borders of the 4 regions that Russia claims as their own, you can see a straight line from right to left, from east to west. The line of contact is moving, and all indications are that the West is out of weapons. The West is tired of the war. When you ask me, like, why did we lose the war, and then you sort of change it to why do I think we lost the war, or what evidence is there that we lost the war? The reason we've lost the war is because Russia's a much bigger country and the supply chains are right there, and our supply chains are thousands of miles away. And there was only so much the West was willing to commit, and for Russia, this was an existential war. And so they would commit everything to the war. And so I think any unbiased observation of just the movement of the line of contact since Ukraine's failed counteroffensive of 2023 objectively tells you that this has been one-way travel, as we like to say in the sporting world. And just look at the numbers. I mean, Ukraine is struggling with recruiting. The U.S. is no longer going to be supporting weapons at the same rate and scale that it was in the past. And again, the Ukrainians have fought heroically, like incredibly patriotic, desperate, effective fighting. They've stared down the Russian army for 3 years and have not yet collapsed. But I think objectively, it's difficult to see a path to victory from here for Ukraine.
Now, I'm curious, like the comments below this video will say, again, Doomberg's paid off by the Russians. Like, I'm pretty sure we could see it, one of those comments. But, it's tough to argue. We had Colonel Douglas Macgregor on the channel earlier this Sunday, and he said similar things. But I forgot to follow up with him asking, like, why do you say that? Like, why do you think Ukraine's lost the war? So I'm glad you answered that one. I appreciate that. I just went to Deep State, to deepstatemap.live as well, and one thing I struggle with, and I'm sure you've seen it as well, but in Budapest, there's the clown emoji. Okay. And it says Orban's pro-Russian regime. So it's like, how do I fit that in? It's like if any of our viewers go to deepstatemap.live, or what is it, deepstatemap.live as well, like,
sure.
How serious should I take it?
So in the piece that we wrote a year ago called Mapping the War, we opened the piece with the difficulty involved in cutting through propaganda. So the commenters who will undoubtedly say that we are, Putin apologists or are paid off by the Russian regime are swimming in their own pool of propaganda as well. And we try really hard to cut through propaganda. I think as an analyst, it's like one of the most important jobs you have to do. So in fact, in that piece, we talked about how we follow the deep mapping project, which is, as you just proved, unabashedly pro-Ukrainian. And then there are pro-Russian mappers, and then there are mappers that are sort of more neutral. And when you look at all three, our general rule is that if all three are in agreement that a major change in the line of contact has occurred over the period of days or weeks, then that's probably true, right? And the interesting thing about this dynamic of mapping projects is if any particular one of them is way out of line with the others, they lose credibility. So even though deep state is very much pro-Ukraine, and as they should be, that actually makes them a stronger source of evidence that the war is not going in Ukraine's direction, because if they're admitting what's going on in reality, then that's probably pretty sound evidence of it, don't you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely, Doomberg. It makes sense. I was just curious, like it popped up. I was like, what do I make of that? How do I sort this? Like, where do I put it? Categorize it, right? Coming back to let's call them peace talks. They were apparently quite productive, based on the U.S. president's words. He's supposed to meet with President Vladimir Putin this month, based on his own narrative here. And it seems like there's progress being made, and there's seemingly even more progress on the energy side. You mentioned ExxonMobil earlier, but it feels like, and I've seen some discussions yesterday, I think, where the energy prices are already being discussed of coming down. How cheap is it going to get again in Europe? Is like, are we getting way ahead of ourselves, or is this a done deal here?
You know, what's interesting is the talks in Saudi Arabia, and even you just did so now, have been characterized as being focused on Ukraine. And actually, I don't think the subject of Ukraine came up all that much. It seems like the early discussions are more about normalizing U.S.-Russian relations, which, by the way, stands in contrast to the yet another new round of sanctions that Europe put through. I believe it was just yesterday. Talk about like ships going in different directions, right? I think the vast majority of what's going on in Saudi Arabia is let's fix all these other aspects of our relationship, rebuild some trust between the two sides, and then tackle the hard problem of Ukraine. Because actually, compared to Ukraine, all the other problems that challenge the relationship between the US and Russia are far easier to solve. There are deals to be done. And so if you accumulate enough goodwill between the two sides, then it becomes easier to make meaningful compromise on the question of Ukraine, at least in theory. And that's what I think is going on. And so the characterization of this meeting, especially in the European press, I think is fundamentally incorrect. And in fact, Trump doesn't like the Ukraine topic. It's not really his war in his mind, and he would like it to end. And so he's more than willing to do all these other things to prove that he means it when he says he wants the war to end. And I think you should view this rapprochement between Russia and US through that lens.
No, it's an interesting topic. I'm really trying to make sense of it all. Like you mentioned the Paris meeting, then there's the Riyadh meeting, then there's Keir Starmer on the Telegraph. Like it seems like there's three different groups talking about the same thing, and Ukraine is not part of any of these discussions. It seems like.
You know, it's a fascinating time. And again, coloring all of this conversation today is both of us just trying to make sense of a tsunami of historic events that are coming at us on an hourly basis, right? And so, like everybody, we're struggling to understand it. And we just have developed this worldview. Like Trump thinks the war was wrong. Trump thinks Biden was catastrophically weak. Trump respects Putin and Xi Jinping more than any Western leaders certainly do today. And he wants to cut deals. Trump is a deal maker. He's a businessman. He thinks all of these things are distractions. He thinks the Macrons of the world who have sort of Napoleon ambitions and the British intelligence and their sort of designs on empire and influence around the world, like to him, that's all just distractions from the critical path. And now look, he's very pro-American and he's, bashful and you could hate him for lots of reasons, but hating a person doesn't necessarily help you try to understand that person. And our view is to understand what's going on in the world, you have to begin by trying to understand Trump.
No, it makes sense. Makes sense there, Doomberg. You used the word transformative earlier by describing Trump, but I also want to use the word transformative in the context of Europe being transformed. Like we talked about potentially U.S. troops leaving. Maybe we'll investigate that topic a little bit. And what will the European security situation look like in potentially like 12, 24 months? Let's assume he announces tomorrow that the U.S. will pull its troops out of Germany, for example. What's going to happen?
We've been toying with some off-the-wall ideas because there is one sort of intractable issue with the Ukraine war, which is Putin wants a permanent solution to the security architecture of Europe, which can really only be delivered through a new treaty. And such a treaty would be all but impossible to get through the U.S. Senate. And so that's not something Trump can deliver. But what if he just pulls out of NATO? Would that solve Putin's security dilemma in Europe? Perhaps. And easier for Trump to do directly, I think. I mean, we're not constitutional lawyers. But if Trump decides to pull out of NATO, that's one way to solve this seemingly unsolvable issue of needing a treaty to convince the Russians that Trump is serious about peace. Now, again, cue the comments. I'm just trying to think of creative ways, low probability outcomes that we can model for the people that read our work. And that seems to be fitting the pattern of behavior that we've seen. So if you ponder that Trump may be contemplating leaving NATO and then go back and listen to Pete Hegseth's speech and J.D. Vance's speech, then suddenly what they're up to might not be so surprising. Now, do I think the U.S. is going to pull out of NATO? No. Do I think that the threat of the U.S. pulling out of NATO is on the table to bring Europe on side, quote unquote, from the Trump perspective? Perhaps. We've seen rumblings to that effect in the news. And so back to your whole question about fear, I think Trump has very little use for NATO. And NATO really, in his mind, is probably a British Atlanticist type architecture. And he has very little patience for them at the moment.
Yeah, it's like he's been teasing it, but I'm not sure. It's like I'm trying to categorize it again as well, like trying to make sense of it. It seems like more shock and awe, like because the U.S. does have quite a bit to lose. Like they would lose a big ally in Europe. It doesn't make any sense for them, like potentially even economically. But then again, like we need to wake up here in Europe. And I do understand it, like from an economic point of view, that the U.S. cannot finance like our like defense anymore. Like it doesn't make any sense. Like, and I get that part. Like, why shouldn't we carry our own weight? Can we afford it? I don't know. Like in Germany, we have the Schuldenbremse. Like we have a debt ceiling. Like, or not? It's not a debt ceiling. Like, I'm not sure what the English word for that actually is, but
it's a constitutional limit on the amount of debt that you can hold. Yeah.
Exactly, right? Yeah. Which the new government, which is a nice segue, by the way, could potentially lift and maybe put through the Bundestag and ask for it to be lifted. Like that'd be the next step. So I'm just trying to make sense of it all. It's like maybe I'm talking to myself here, just trying to explain it to myself what is happening. It is really just shock and awe and trying to wake up. Right?
So look, I would say one thing about what you characterized as Trump sort of putting it out there. It could also be that he's conditioning. Like he may have already decided that this is something he's going. Look, there's a reason why Russia has agreed to these talks so quickly and they've moved as rapidly as they have. Because in my mind, if Trump and Putin are going to meet, traditionally, that would mean that a deal is already baked. You don't bring the president of the United States and the president of Russia together for a summit, historically at least, without a lot of things being agreed in advance. Now, it's not always the case, and it could still break down. But if you view Trump's hinting around at the prospect of pulling out of NATO as a preconditioning, as a test run for public response, I think if you ask the average American, should we stay in NATO, I think that you'd be surprised at the lack of support for it.
Yeah, it just costs money and doesn't really add any benefit. It's like, if you look at it, it's like, why would you support Europe and financially in particular?
It's a classic isolationism too, right? I mean, when your neighborhood and your city and your state are struggling, like classic example is why would we want to engage in a nuclear conflict with Russia over the Donbass? If you're in Wisconsin, you care about Wisconsin. And the U.S. government has not done a good job of taking care of the home front, which is another reason why Trump was reelected. And so I think, and look, no alliances last forever. Borders don't last forever. They get redrawn all the time. So there's a view that he's not just sort of, he's not just trolling. I think he may have gauge the interest of Russia in if we leave NATO, but we do this sort of as a trade-off, because there's something being offered by the U.S. that has caught the interest of Russia, in my view.
No, one thing Russia is definitely looking for is like a buffer zone, right, between Europe or NATO and Russia itself. And I mentioned it to you earlier, and I keep coming back to that topic. I can't get it out of my head, and I hope people are not tired of it. I'll just share it real quick, but it's this topic. It's the topic of the hypersonic missile. Like the U.S. is very close to having it. It's almost like, you can almost use it on the battlefield if you wanted to. That's just from December 12th. Russia apparently already has that. They really want to protect Moscow, because with hypersonic missiles, stationed in Ukraine, maybe on the border of Russia, you could be in Moscow within a couple of minutes.
So this is an example of a breakdown in the post-Cold War architecture that led to the war in Ukraine. And so if the U.S. pulls out of NATO and pulls its troops out of Germany and doesn't supply, such missile technology to its European quote-unquote allies, that solves a lot of problems for Putin. At least if you, assume that Putin is a rational actor. Many in Europe don't. I'm just saying, if you assume that Putin is a rational actor, such a move, which the Russians characterize as, quote, solving the root cause of the crisis, must be what has captured their interest. And again, we're outsiders. What do we know? We're just trying to understand the news flow as it comes. And one of our jokes internally is a working model need not be true. It just needs to work. So when we try to develop working models to analyze the news, the only thing we really care about, we'd like them to be true, is that they do an accurate job of both explaining past news and predicting future events.
Talking about future events, Doomberg, like switching gears just a little bit, but Germany, we have an election coming up. How do you think that'll impact anything in that we've just discussed, or anything in Europe in particular?
Well, you're there, and so you have an advantage over me, although I have been following the situation probably as closely as somebody based in the U.S. can, who doesn't speak German, so it's difficult for me to read the primary papers. I'm concerned about an outcome where no stable government can be formed. Depending on how strong the AfD does, the stronger it does, by the way, the more likely it is that no government can be formed. I think Friedrich Merz has fumbled the ball greatly in this campaign, and I think it's going to be very difficult to stitch together any combination of parties that does not include the AfD to form a stable government. And so I don't know what happens in that scenario. But broadly speaking, such crises of politics aren't conducive to cohesion. And I'd be very interested in observing the following metric, which is the difference between the support for the AfD in Eastern Germany, the states that made up of the former East German state, and the states in Western Germany. And if that delta is large enough, and it might be, it could begin to call into question the sanctity of the state of Germany itself. Again, low probability outcome, but one that we have been contemplating internally as we observe this campaign.
It's interesting. I'm just looking at the latest polling results here, and I'm worried that nothing is going to change. Maybe the CDU will become the strongest power. I think that's the strongest party. Sure, we'll get a new chancellor, but they'll have to find a coalition partner. And right now, the second strongest or third strongest party would be the SPD, the Socialist Party, and the Green Party, right? And Merz already mentioned very early on in the campaign, he could even imagine Habeck becoming economic minister again, or minister of economy. If that happens, I'd call for re-election just in 2 weeks again. It's an absolute joke that we're even discussing that. Personally, it gets me enraged.
In what world would those parties agree to form a government together? And then even in that event, in what world could they do anything meaningful? They have such fundamental disagreements in policy. Now, in a universe where Olaf Scholz's party and Merz's party combined are comfortably above 50% of the seats, okay. But if you need the Greens on top of all of that, I don't know how it works.
No.
So, again, the stronger the sort of far right party, to use the vernacular of the day, does in this election, the more destabilizing it could be. And I don't know, you tell me, but does it feel like the momentum is breaking towards Friedrich Merz at this time?
Well, it's definitely Friedrich Merz going to be the next chancellor. I think that's
Well,
without
to be
doubt. The question is
chancellor,
what it will look like afterwards, right? Like, but why is he categorically ruling out working with the AFD, for example?
well,
Right?
you're better positioned to answer that than me. But is it really a lock that he's going to be chancellor? I think it's a lock that he will win a plurality of the vote. But winning the plurality of the vote is not necessarily assuring that he would become chancellor, right? I mean, so he would be invited to form a government, but what happens if no coalition that produces a majority of the votes is generated?
It depends a little bit on what BSW does, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. Like, we don't have to go into these details.
Sure.
That's where it gets a little more, convoluted here. But if they get in as well, then we could have a red-green kind of event as well, which would cause me probably to move, quite honestly. And then we'll have the AFD at 45% next election.
What's amazing is actually, if you sum up, the quote far left and far right, and really the sort of center, support for Ukraine is not a majority position anymore in German politics. And so if a government can't be formed that supports that view, it's a breakdown in democracy itself. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah,
Like we will be watching with great interest, of course, almost as much as you. We write about Germany a fair bit, and we have many German friends, and we love them dearly. We wish nothing but the best possible outcome for Germany. It's a real shame what's happened in that country, and we certainly, critiquing the existing leaders does not in any way reflect on our views of the country.
No, and it shouldn't. Like, it's very disappointing what's happening there. Maybe Doomberg, one last question, though, is depending on the election outcome Sunday, what will our energy policy look like moving forward here? What do you think is going to happen?
It depends if the Green Party is needed for a coalition, which is something we wrote about several months ago in our first sort of foray into the German election. That the result that matters is whether Merz can form a government without the Greens. If he can form a government without the Greens, I think we will begin to see a revisiting of the nuclear question in Germany. Obviously, just as important is whether there is a peace in Ukraine that is accepted by Europe and whether the gas could be turned back on, especially Nord Stream. And so those are the questions that I think will be answered in the weeks and months ahead. And, no matter how it plays out, historic times await. I mean, so at least in that narrow sense, I can hardly imagine a more interesting time to be doing what we do for a living.
Absolutely. Just looking at the commodity prices, crude oil and Brent here on my other screen, and they're still sort of where we were last time, where we chatted about $72, $75. Doomberg. Not much has happened. We spoke about, I think it was 6 months ago. I haven't double checked, to be honest, but not much has happened. But maybe very last question, Doomberg. I know I want to be conscious of your time here, but let's assume the Russia-Ukraine war gets settled tomorrow. Where do you think energy prices will go?
I think the equilibrium price of oil in this market is $50-ish. I think natural gas LNG landed 8 to 10. I see coal is at $100 a ton. That is sort of the global equilibrium price where LNG landed in Europe and Brent trade on an energy content basis that is equilibrated, and natural gas producers in the U.S. can earn their cost of capital. And I think there is a combination of geopolitical risk factor, but mostly OPEC supporting the price of oil to keep it above $70 a barrel. And I don't think it's coincidental that the meeting between Russia and the U.S. was held in Saudi Arabia, and the three of them combined are by far the largest producers of oil in the world. Trump wants oil prices to come down. I think there would be a peace dividend in that way. And so, OPEC is currently protecting the price of oil. Not sure how much longer they can do that. But if, to your specific question, if we woke up tomorrow and a durable peace was achieved, that also, say, includes the question of Iran, which we didn't get into, but we can talk about next time. I think the downward pressure on commodity prices would be profound.
Yeah, we haven't even touched on the Israel-Iran situation yet, Doomberg. That's a whole different, like, an hour we can probably spend on that topic as well. What's happening in Syria? What's the interest of the Turks? Like, why is Syria so important for the connection to the Hezbollah as well? And how is Israel sort of influencing the whole region? We'll talk about that next time. By the way, you just gave me a beautiful YouTube title as well. Chasing Peace Dividends might be the title of this video. So I hope I didn't steal your next article title here as well, but kind of like that one. So
It's all yours, my friend.
okay, appreciate that. Doomberg, what a wonderful conversation. We'll put a bow around it here. It's like almost a superfluous question, but Doomberg.com, obviously, where we can find more of your work. Anywhere else we can send our viewers, or is that...
That's it. Everything we do is there. Our monthly articles, our pro-tier monthly webinars, which we're about to tee up. We've got a great one on natural gas liquids, hopefully publishing soon. Kai, it's always a pleasure. Really amazing success of your channel. Very well deserved. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and looking forward to the next time as well.
Absolutely. Same here as well. Doomberg, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Very insightful. And to everybody else, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Doomberg. Way more geopolitical than I thought it would go, which I really enjoy, because geopolitics have been increasingly of interest to me, and they're just fascinating. Trying to understand what is shaping the world. Geopolitics and the bond market are the two most important factors, I'd say, and we've covered geopolitics extensively today. If you enjoyed this conversation, hit that like and subscribe button. Helps us out tremendously, and it's a free way to support the channel. What do you think is going to happen in the next few weeks? Or put that in the comments down below, and make sure to turn on that bell notification. We got lots more coming up here in the coming days. Thank you so much for tuning in. Take care.